Welcome back. Today we'll begin our adventures in the grand scale of human history and see the various roles played by the arts throughout. Hopefully you've watched the video linked at the beginning of this module. But here's a variation of that theme, only instead of a map of the US, all of Earth's history is plotted out on a football field. Everything that seems so important to us is just the tiniest blip in the grand scheme of things. Just try to imagine. And don't get caught up on the exact dates here. These get adjusted from time to time as new discoveries are made. That's one of the great things about science. You can change your mind anytime you get new information, and it doesn't mean you're selling out your beliefs or that you're indecisive or blasphemous. It just means you use your brain. But anyway, when you think of the chronological relationships here, it's mind-boggling. Big Bang, 14.5 billion years ago. Formation of the Earth, around 4.5 billion years ago. That amount of time is really impossible for us to comprehend in a direct sense. Hominids evolved around 4 to 6 million years ago. Early versions of humans, maybe 2 million years ago. Homo sapiens, only around 500,000 years ago. And so if you look at this slide here, 500,000 years ago is the equivalent of being like well inside the 1 yard line, like the 1 inch line on this football field. Talk about being born with first and goal to go. This slide here is just a small section. Genetically modern humans came around 150 to 200,000 years ago. See the tiny red dot on the extreme right-hand side of this image? The tip of the fingertip. That's the emergence of humanity. Art itself goes back, as far as we know, 44,000 years ago, just after what some anthropologists call the Great Leap Forward. Agriculture and what we think of as civilization, that's only 10,000 years ago. All of recorded history, maybe 5,500 years ago. The whole existence of the United States, 240 so years ago. A tiny drop in the ocean, as you can see. Your whole life is just a speck on a very tiny speck. Try to put human history in perspective, and it's practically impossible. But anyway, art goes back well beyond nearly every other identifiable feature of humanity. It's way more a part of what it is to be human than politics, organized religion, the concept of the nation state, fast food. It's certainly older than civilization itself. Civilization is only goes back 1/4 as far as art does, and almost certainly much less even, as we see playing out by one archaeological discovery after another. Remember then, the first part of this course, dates are very approximate and often conflicting. The important thing to get from this is the context and the general idea of the dates and relationships. Consider the following incredibly humble object. This object is known as the Makapansgat stone. Picture the scene. South Africa, 3 million years ago, an ape-like creature dies clutching this very special stone in her hand. Maybe not, but it was found very far from its source, very near the remains of an Australopithecus, a potential ancestor of hominids. Is it art? Well, what does it look like to you? A face, of course. There's no evidence it was actually made by someone. It was, in all likelihood, just carved by natural forces. But for it to have been found where it was, it would have to have been consciously carried a considerable distance. And these creatures did not have a pocket and fancy designer jeans. Why would this very proto-human, primitive even by primate standards, go to this sort of trouble to carry this thing around? The implications are clear. There was likely some kind of aesthetic intent, evidence of symbolic thought. And this was way before anything like modern human existence. This was 500,000 years before even the use of tools. The Paleolithic, or Old Stone Age, lasted from around 2 million years ago until 10,000 BCE. And this varies depending on who you ask. Most of the earliest art we're aware of starts off around 44,000 years ago. Even though that's just a blip on the screen of humanity, still, it's a long time ago. It's a challenge to cover that many years of art in such a small amount of time, so my apologies for not being able to cover everything as adequately as I'd like in this chapter. And because of the time constraints, I'll focus mostly on periods and works throughout this whole course that I'm more familiar with. So some important things will be left out. The scope of this course is just too broad for it to be otherwise. But there are a lot of resources posted to the Canvas site for you to dive further into if you like. But just imagine the mystery of everything if you lived 44,000 years ago. No written preservation of knowledge, certainly none of the creature comforts we take for granted, but most of all, the profound sense of mystery about the universe they must have felt. And dated to just that time, this painting, which was discovered in a cave in South Sulawesi, Indonesia in 2017, we see human-animal hybrid figures hunting pigs and dwarf buffaloes. This is the oldest known art discovery. It pushes our awareness of art way back by about 5 to 10,000 years from what we previously knew. Here's what's traditionally referred to as the Venus of Willendorf, or the Woman of Willendorf. As with other Paleo-Venuses, the name is really misleading. It's just a label, nothing more. Definitely it's not an inference of any intent of the person making it. But this stylized female form from 28,000 to 23,000 BCE. You notice the exaggerated breasts and genital area. There's very little attention to other aspects of the figure. Paleolithic sculpture was almost uniformly figurative, depicting women, almost never men, and these women were highly stylized, abstracted. In what ways are they usually stylized? It seems to be almost always enhancing these childbearing qualities, perhaps. Why? Who knows? It could be the significance of creating a new life. You could imagine how important, particularly at the time, that would have been, and how and how mysterious. Or maybe it was just paleo porn. This is a photograph taken inside Chauvet Cave in France. These cave paintings in this cave date from around 30,000 years ago. For a long time, this was the earliest known cave painting. What's this about? A lot of the images are likely depicting some kind of ritual. Shamanic or magical aspects are usually attributed to the imagery. Notice the sophistication of the images. Specific shapes are not as idealized as the sculptures we just looked at, and they're always depicted from a similar angle. Just look at the line work and the specificity of the details. This would have had to have been from a very precise memory from close observation. It's not like they could have brought these beasts into the caves to pose for them. Yet still, they come to life. Here we see Lascaux Cave. This is the most famous of all the painted prehistoric cave paintings. This is from around 17,000 years ago. There's an extensive collection of images here, 2,000 figures, revealing depictions of animals, humans, abstract signs. And there's no landscape or environment in them. The figures are always just floating. Regarding the animals that are depicted, you notice a very specific naturalism that indicate this keen memory of anatomy. And this is consistent in almost all of the Paleolithic cave paintings we find. Is it a coincidence? How could so many disparate people with no contact with one another follow rules that were never written down across every generation and geographical location? That's weird to say the least. And I would say one of the great mysteries of ancient art. And what's more, while the imagery is relatively specific and representational for animals, it's very abstracted and stylized for humans. You see this sort of twisted perspective, a profile in some parts, frontal in other parts, and practically a stick figure. Very little specific nuance and details when they're depicting humans. And we'll notice a pattern here. Throughout all of prehistory and early history, we see animals depicted in a very naturalistic and very representational way, where humans are depicted in a very abstract way. Again, I don't think anyone really knows why, but it seems odd that how consistent that is. But it's always in this twisted sort of perspective, this amalgamation of points of view. So why were these created? They're not easy to make. Often they're found very deep in the caves, very hard to get to, which is the reason they've been undiscovered for so long. So they're not decorative. There's no way that people would have lived in these parts of the cave. They don't always depict objects of a hunt. In fact, rarely do they depict objects in a hunt. None of the animals here are reindeer, which is what people mostly ate. It seems like an indication of some kind of mysticism or religious intent. Abstract shapes are similar to visual hallucination patterns, maybe mushroom-induced artistic revelry, or altered states from sensory deprivation. Could they be based on religious rituals? And why are all these figures just floating in space instead of being placed in some kind of environment or landscape? Some researchers say that a lot of the abstract shapes are parts of star charts, corresponding to the star locations during that part of the Paleolithic period. Paintings in some caves are located to catch light on the setting sun on the day of the winter solstice. So there's definitely some kind of larger intent here beyond just the purely decorative. At Le Toup-d'Aubert in France, we see these animals sculpted in the rock in high relief from about 14,000 years ago. We see the arching back, curving tail, even the textured hair. Like in the paintings we've seen, these are strikingly naturalistic. This matches the strict patterns seen throughout ancient art. Are these rules? Human depiction is highly abstracted, while animals are free to be representationally depicted. This even lasts into civilized art until quite recently, around 2,500 years ago, which is very recently, really. It's this twisted perspective or composite pose, stylized and naturalistic. In the Mesolithic period, we see like kind of a transitional time marked by receding glaciers and a warming climate. Painting moved outdoors. We see more human and animal interaction. But it's the Neolithic period that began around 10,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago BCE, where we see a really big turning point. And this comes mostly in the discovery of agriculture, at least in its primitive form. Humans begin to exert concrete control over their environment. Agriculture pushes out natural habitats. We see this concept of property, and we see a commodification of food versus the subsistence grazing and hunting that we had seen before. The planting and replanting allowed for surplus. Surplus equals property equals commodity. This was a complete and utter revolution in human lifestyle. It's really hard to overstate. We see the beginnings of what you could think of as an organized religious kind of tradition. It's interesting that this seems to start at the same time that the concept of property does. There's evidence of personal and tribal religion goes way back, but now it coalesces around social organizations in a way that mirrors the complexity of social changes that were going on. And it was used to maintain a social order. And this social order needed to be maintained as well as the property needed to be guarded. And we see architecture building up around this point in time in the form of like places to live permanently, since you're planting and replanting, you can stay put, but also in fortifications. Now that there was property and wealth, it needed to be guarded. These are really the foundations for what we're going to call civilization. And it's unique in the history of humanity, and in that history, it's a very recent development. This is just a short moment ago when all this was taking place on compared to the whole history of humanity. Is this a step ahead or a step backwards? Evidence from pockets of remaining Paleolithic cultures that we could see cut off from the world today. Things that anthropologists have noticed is way more hours of work per day now that we work than people did then. On the average, they spent around 2 to 3 hours a day working, which entailed gathering, maybe hunting, different things. And the rest of their days were spent with family and friends, just hanging out. We have a 40-hour work week in our society, but try getting ahead working only 40 hours a week. We also have traffic, pollution, all sorts of problems that they never would have even been able to conceive of. Also, perhaps the concept of unhappiness and dissatisfaction didn't exist in the same way then as it does now. Before the Neolithic Revolution. No greed or envy compared to now. Imagine a life free from all the stresses and obligations of modern life. But it's not that there aren't benefits to civilization too. But all the trappings of culture start here. Urban centers, written language, trade and commerce, common religion, and centralized government. Plus, we see so many precursors to events that shape modern cultural, religious, and historical notions. And here's the Fertile Crescent. This is the area where the first true civilizations emerged. And these were really a culmination of the Agrarian Revolution and the Neolithic period we just talked about. This is when we move out of the Stone Age. This is the birthplace of the three major Western religious traditions as well. By 4500 BCE, the transition was complete, starting probably in Mesopotamia, then soon around places near the Yellow River in China and the Indus River Valley in India. This ushered in all the hallmarks of what makes civilization. Back to the map. Mesopotamia is the land around and between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And as I said, this is the first place where that transition is complete, where we leave the Neolithic period and enter the age of civilization. Why Mesopotamia? Well, if you look at the conditions there around this time, there were relatively harsh summers and dry winters. And then floods came and wiped out everything. That sounds terrible, right? But actually, that was kind of a good thing for civilization, because that meant the soil was incredibly fertile. Some archaeologists say it was the perfect balance of conditions. Not too easy to live to where you don't have to organize into large groups of people and store food and have a surplus, but also not too hard to where you couldn't do that if you wanted. It's kind of the Goldilocks kind of thing. The first of these civilizations are the Sumerians. And the Sumerians started between 4500 and 4000 BCE, and they controlled the flow of the rivers to irrigate fields that they were growing. They were organized into relatively autonomous city-states, and each city-state had a ruling and protecting god. The rulers were priests who served their particular city-state's god. Forget separation of church and state. They were one and the same, as with most of the others in the ancient world. A stabilized lifestyle and government led to specialization. Manufacturing objects like ceramics, complex tools, machines to make processes easier, irrigation systems, even the invention of the wheel. Some of the earliest written language, cuneiform, was made up of little wedges and printed into clay tablets or seals. These are just some of the things the Sumerians were credited with inventing. Here's a collection of Sumerian votive sculptures. You see that they're stylized, figurative sculptures, and it's always really easy to identify Sumerian figurative art. The eyes are always like huge and staring out, and hands held in front of the body. What was their purpose? Well, one theory is that they were stand-ins for people too busy to pray. That way they could stay on good graces with their god, sort of like multitasking. These sculptures create an interesting precursor to later sculptural traditions. With the Varka vase, we see imagery organized into narrative bands, which is very unlike any of the cave imagery we've seen where they were just floating around in space. Here we see a clear ground line for these bands, these narrative bands, and we see also a hierarchy of scale. So the larger the figures are, the more prominent or important they are in the narrative. Some of these same conventions established with the Sumerians are used today in comics and graphic novels. Perhaps the most notable example of Sumerian culture is the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is the earliest great work of literature. Scenes in this story have parallels to biblical texts. The flood passage in the Christian Bible and Jewish Bible mimic almost word for word the account in the Epic of Gilgamesh. While the Sumerian culture comes and goes, and later comes into some prominence again, other Mesopotamian cultures flourish at one time or the other. The Akkadians are the next big example, and Sargon I, the first great Akkadian conqueror, unites Mesopotamia into a single empire, the first one in history. Sargon has a familiar rags to riches story, something that might sound familiar. According to legend, he was an illegitimate baby found in a basket in the river and goes on to become a great king from humble beginnings. This was actually a common folk tale for many powerful men at the time. Stories, just like art, can serve as propaganda. Here's a sculpted head that was likely a depiction of Sargon I. Notice the really interesting pattern in the beard. Around 1900 BCE, we see the Babylonians, and they too came and went out of prominence a couple times. And they also coincided with a lot of biblical stories. You've probably heard of the Babylonians. The Law Code of Hammurabi is maybe their most notable contribution here. Nearly 250 laws to be followed. This is the earliest known preserved written laws in history, and they governed all aspects of life. Here are some interesting sections. The first one is probably its most famous. That's where an eye for an eye comes from. If a man puts out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. Maybe my favorite now that I'm a father, if a son strikes his father, his hand shall be hewn off. Okay, I'm just kidding. I don't really think that. But some seem a little bit random. If a man's wife is caught in bed with another man, both will be tied up and thrown in the water. Next up are the Assyrians, history's original badasses. The Assyrians really started around 2600 BC as a culture, but became particularly prominent in the 7th century BCE. They almost died out halfway through in a seemingly region-wide event that we'll discuss later on. But like I said, these were the original just bad dudes. They had a reputation for being stunningly vicious in battle. One of their kings, Ashurbanipal, claimed that he dyed the mountains red with the blood of his slaughtered enemies. This was a real shock and awe technique, militarily speaking. But by 612 BCE, Nineveh is sacked and it's all over for the Assyrians. There are so many more interesting events and people of ancient Mesopotamia, but sadly we must move on. The video I posted about ancient Assyria is really interesting and you should check it out. That's it for now. Next time we will move a little bit south and a little bit west. As you see on the map, not too far away from Mesopotamia. I'm talking about ancient Egypt. A culture whose mystery captivates people now as much as any other culture